"I'm not a taxi service for old women," my daughter-in-law said the morning I needed surgery, and I knew, standing there on my own front porch with my overnight bag in one hand and my medical folder in the other, that something inside this family had gone colder than I had ever allowed myself to believe. It was barely after 6:30, the kind of gray Midwestern morning when the air still carried the last bite of night, and the sky over our quiet street looked flat and colorless, like someone had drained the warmth out of it. I had been awake since 4. At 68, sleep came lightly anyway, but that morning I had not even tried. I had showered with the special soap the hospital told me to use, pulled on loose sweatpants and a soft blue cardigan, and packed exactly what the nurse had instructed me to bring. My ID, my insurance card, a phone charger, my reading glasses, and the slippers my late husband used to tease me about because they made me look, in his words, like a stubborn little queen in a retirement commercial. I had set everything by the door the night before so I would not forget anything. Nicole had promised she would take me. She had said it 3 days earlier, in that smooth voice of hers that always sounded polite enough on the surface. Daniel was supposed to meet us at the hospital after a breakfast meeting downtown. That was the plan. Simple. Reasonable. The kind of small family favor people do without making it feel like a debt. But when I stepped outside, Nicole was already standing by her SUV in pressed cream slacks and oversized sunglasses, even though the sun had barely risen. The engine was running. Her coffee sat in the cup holder. She did not look rushed. She looked prepared. "Nicole," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to leave if we want to get there by 7:15. She shut the driver's side door, adjusted the strap of her handbag, and looked at me the way people look at a flyer they already know they are going to throw away. "Actually," she said, "I'm not taking you." At first I thought I had heard her wrong. There are some sentences the mind rejects on instinct simply because no decent person should say them out loud. "I beg your pardon?" I asked. She sighed, not dramatically, just enough to let me know I was inconveniencing her. "I said I'm not driving you. I have things to do, Evelyn. I can't spend my whole day sitting in a hospital waiting room." She said hospital like it was a boring store in a strip mall. I tightened my grip on the folder until the paper edges pressed into my palm. "You told me you would take me," I said. "And Daniel said he'd meet us there." "Daniel is busy," she replied. "And you could have called a car service. People do it all the time." Then she gave a small shrug, the kind that pretends helplessness while delivering cruelty with perfect precision. "Honestly, with everything going on, I don't know why this has to be such a production." For a moment I just stood there, feeling the cold creep through the porch boards into the soles of my slippers. I had lived long enough to recognize when a person was being careless. This was not carelessness. This was something cleaner, sharper, deliberate. I looked past her toward the quiet street, at the maples lining the curb, at old Mr. Donnelly's flag hanging still across the road, at the ordinary calm of a neighborhood that had no idea a family could unravel before breakfast. "Did Daniel know you were going to do this?" I asked. Her mouth curved not quite into a smile. "He knows we need to start being realistic about things." Realistic. That word landed harder than all the others. My surgery suddenly felt like more than a surgery. It felt like a test I had not known I was taking, and I was beginning to understand that if I failed it, I might lose more than my dignity on that porch. I do not remember making the decision to move. Later, I would recall small pieces of it the way people remember a storm after it passes, not as one clean moment, but as scattered details that only make sense when you put them together. My fingers fumbling with my phone, the hospital folder sliding against my coat, Nicole getting into her SUV without another word, the soft click of her door shutting, then the sound of her tires rolling down the street while I remained on the porch, still enough to look like part of the house. I called Daniel first. Once, twice, 3 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. By the 4th, I stopped listening to his greeting. I stood there until the cold began to settle into my knees, and that was when I finally understood something that should have been obvious the moment Nicole looked at me with those flat, careful eyes. No one was coming to rescue me. Not my son. Not the woman he married. Not the family I had spent years protecting from every little discomfort I could absorb for them. I called a car service with shaking fingers, and was told the earliest driver could get to my address in 40 minutes. My check-in time was in less than half an hour. I remember staring at the screen, doing the kind of simple arithmetic that becomes strangely difficult when your chest is tight with humiliation. I was still trying to decide whether I should call the hospital and explain when I heard a screen door open across the street. Mrs. Donnelly stepped out in a quilted robe and white sneakers, a grocery bag hanging from one hand. She must have been on her way back from the corner market. She looked at me once, really looked, and crossed the street without hesitation. There are people who ask polite questions because they enjoy the performance of concern, and then there are people who notice the shape of trouble before you say a word. June Donnelly was the second kind. She stopped at the bottom of my steps and said very simply, "Evelyn, why are you standing out here with a hospital bag?" The answer rose in my throat and caught there. I had not expected kindness to be what finally undid me. "I am supposed to be at St. Matthew's by 7:15, I said. My ride changed her mind. June did not ask who. She did not tilt her head or offer pity. She just shifted the grocery bag to her other hand and said, "Give me 60 seconds. She was back in less than 30, keys in hand, robe exchanged for a navy coat, gray hair still slightly flattened on one side. "Come on," she said. "I have half a tank and enough nerve for both of us." The drive to the hospital took 22 minutes. I know because I watched the dashboard clock the whole way, as if time itself had become an unreliable thing that needed supervising. The heater hummed softly. June kept one hand steady on the wheel, and the other near the cup holder where a paper bag held a carton of eggs and a loaf of wheat bread. Normal groceries. A normal morning. That made the whole thing feel even stranger. The city was just waking up around us. Coffee shops with lights coming on. School buses beginning their routes. Men in reflective vests outside a construction site. Everyone moving forward with the ordinary business of the day while I sat in the passenger seat in my blue cardigan, trying to keep my voice from breaking over a favor my own family should never have forced a neighbor to perform. "You do not have to explain," June said after several minutes of silence. "Good," I answered, looking out the window at a line of bare trees beyond the overpass. "Because I am not sure I can without sounding foolish." She glanced at me briefly. Being abandoned is not the same thing as being foolish. I turned that sentence over in my mind all the way to the hospital entrance. By the time she pulled up beneath the covered drop-off lane, something inside me had changed shape. Not healed. Not hardened completely. But shifted. Because what Nicole had done no longer felt like one cruel decision made on a busy morning. It felt connected to something larger, something I had been refusing to name. And as a volunteer came forward with a wheelchair and a bright plastic smile, I found myself thinking not about the surgery ahead, but about Nicole's last words on the porch. "We need to start being realistic about things." I did not know yet what things she meant, but I knew with a clarity that made my stomach turn, that my operation was not the only event my daughter-in-law had been planning around. The hospital lobby smelled faintly of coffee, floor polish, and that clean filtered air that never quite hides the fact that people come there afraid. I checked in at the front desk, signed forms with a hand that looked steadier than I felt, and answered the usual questions in the same calm voice I had used for years at church bake sales, parent-teacher meetings, and my husband's funeral reception. Name. Date of birth. Emergency contact. Insurance provider. Allergies. It was not until the young woman behind the desk glanced at her screen and frowned very slightly that the first true crack appeared in the morning. "Mrs. Parker," she said, lowering her voice, "I just want to confirm that your daughter is still your primary contact for post-procedure coordination." I looked up from the clipboard. "My daughter," I said. "I do not have a daughter." She blinked, then turned the monitor a fraction toward herself and read more carefully. "I am sorry. Says here Nicole Parker. Relationship listed as daughter." For one second, the room seemed to tip in a way that had nothing to do with illness or nerves. I could hear a television mounted in the corner murmuring about traffic delays on Interstate 90. I could hear the squeak of rubber saws from somewhere down the corridor. I could hear June speaking with the volunteer near the entrance. Everything sounded unnaturally clear, as if my mind had decided to sharpen every small detail, so I would never be able to tell myself later that I misunderstood. "She is my daughter-in-law," I said, "and I did not authorize any changes this morning." The woman at the desk gave me the polite, guarded expression of someone trained not to react too much in front of patients. There is also a note here from yesterday asking to be contacted before discharge planning begins, she said. Would you like me to remove that? Yesterday. Nicole had called yesterday. While I was laying out my clothes and making sure I had not forgotten my insurance card, she had been arranging to place herself between me and every decision that might come after the surgery. Yes, I said. Please remove it. My voice came out low and even, and somehow that frightened me more than if I had sounded upset, because anger can flare and disappear. But this was something quieter. This was a door inside me closing. The clerk nodded and typed for a few seconds. Who would you like listed instead? She asked. I should have said Daniel. A mother is supposed to say her son almost by instinct. But I thought of the unanswered calls. I thought of Nicole standing beside the running SUV, already dressed for some other plan. I thought of that careful phrase again. We need to start being realistic about things. June Donnelly, I said. The name sat between us with surprising ease. The clerk entered it without question, then printed a new page for me to initial. My signature looked firm and unfamiliar, like the handwriting of a woman who had already begun making decisions I had not fully admitted to myself. Not long after that, a nurse with warm brown eyes and a pink scrub cap came to take me back for pre-op. June squeezed my hand once before I stood, and I noticed that her fingers were cold from carrying her car keys. You call me when you are ready, she said. Even if it is 3 in the afternoon and I am in the middle of making meatloaf. I smiled, and for the first time that morning it did not feel forced. In the pre-op bay they gave me a pale gown, grippy socks, and a plastic bag for my clothes. I folded my cardigan carefully, smoothing the sleeves the way I used to smooth Daniel's church shirts when he was little and squirmed too much for proper ironing. Memory has a cruel way of arriving exactly when it is least useful. I saw him at 8 years old, one front tooth missing, crying because he thought a blood test would hurt. I had held his hand and promised I would be right there when it was over. Later, at 12, I had driven across town in freezing rain because he forgot his trumpet before a school concert. At 19, I had sat outside an emergency dental appointment for 3 hours with a travel mug of cold tea because he hated going in alone. The boy who once called me from college because he could not figure out how to roast a chicken was now a grown man whose wife had listed herself as my daughter in the hospital system, while he let my calls go unanswered. There are moments when betrayal does not feel dramatic. Feels administrative. A line changed in a database. A role rewritten on a form. A decision made in a voice so calm it almost passes for helpful. The nurse came back to place my identification band around my wrist and confirm the procedure one more time. As she checked the chart, she said, "Looks like everything is updated now." Updated. Such a harmless word. But lying there beneath the thin warmed blanket, listening to the curtain rings slide now and then on metal tracks, I realized that someone had been trying to update my place in the family too. Quietly. Efficiently. As if I were already halfway out the door. When they wheeled me toward the operating room, I closed my eyes for a moment and saw Harold's hands. Not his face at first, not the neat part in his silvering hair or the reading glasses he was always misplacing, but his hands, broad and dry and steady, the hands that knew how to fix a dripping faucet, wrap Christmas lights without tangling them, and hold the small of my back in a crowded room as if the world ought to make space for me simply because I was his wife. Grief is a strange thing that way. It does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it slips into the room like sunlight under a door, touching the smallest details first. Harold had been gone for almost 4 years, but in that narrow hospital corridor, with the ceiling lights passing overhead one square at a time, I felt the absence of him so sharply that it seemed almost physical. If he had been alive, none of this would have happened the way it did. I do not mean that in the childish sense that a husband can wave away all pain or inconvenience. I mean something simpler and harder. Harold paid attention. He noticed shifts in tone. He heard what people meant underneath what they said. And once he began to suspect that Nicole was the sort of woman who smiled with her mouth and calculated with her silence, he never again left me alone with my doubts. The first time he said it out loud was over coffee on a Sunday afternoon 2 years before he died. Nicole had just left after bringing over a peach pie from the fancy bakery near her Pilates studio, the one that cost too much and somehow still tasted less sincere than the ones I made from scratch. She had kissed my cheek, complimented my curtains, and spent 20 minutes asking Harold questions about the house in a tone so airy that a less careful man might have mistaken it for harmless curiosity. How old was the roof? Had we ever considered downsizing? Was the neighborhood still appreciating? Harold waited until her car turned the corner before setting down his mug and saying, "That girl does not ask questions unless she already wants the answers to belong to her." I remember laughing then. Not because it was funny, but because I did not want to begin seeing what he already saw. Daniel loved her. Love makes mothers generous in all the wrong directions. We call it patience when we are really swallowing discomfort to keep the peace for our sons. Harold, on the other hand, had never been sentimental about manipulation. He believed in manners, kindness, and giving people the benefit of the doubt exactly once. After that, he believed in pattern recognition. He noticed Nicole interrupted Daniel in little ways that looked modern and efficient to outsiders but landed differently if you were paying attention. He noticed she answered questions meant for him, corrected his memories in front of company, and treated family plans as if they were corporate meetings she chaired by default. The year before Harold passed, Daniel had started stopping by less often. The excuses sounded reasonable. Work deadlines. Traffic. Nicole had yoga. Nicole had dinner with clients. Nicole was tired. Nicole had already made other plans. My son had always been a little too eager to keep everyone comfortable, and after Harold died, that trait curdled into something weaker. He stopped arguing not because he agreed but because resistance required energy, and Nicole had a way of making disagreement feel exhausting. I saw it at Thanksgiving the first year I was alone. Daniel offered to come early and help carve the turkey the way his father used to. Nicole arrived 20 minutes late, stood in my kitchen in a camel-colored coat that looked too expensive for a family meal, and said with a breezy smile, "We can only stay an hour." Daniel promised we would stop by my cousin's place too. Daniel had not told me that. He just adjusted the napkins and looked vaguely apologetic, as if events organized themselves around him without his participation. Small things. That is how families are rearranged now. Not with shouting. With schedules. With revised expectations. With one person steadily deciding what is practical until everyone else is too tired to ask who appointed her. Harold hated that word when Nicole used it. Practical. Selfish people love practical, he once told me while we were raking leaves in the backyard. It sounds respectable. Lying under that warmed hospital blanket, waiting for strangers in scrubs to wheel me through doors that only staff could open, I finally understood how often Harold had been standing guard without making a performance of it. He had not protected me by controlling the room. He had protected me by witnessing it accurately. And after he died, there was no one left in the family who insisted on accuracy. Daniel drifted. Nicole advanced. I adjusted. That is the truth I did not want to say aloud, even to myself. I adjusted to smaller invitations, shorter visits, decisions explained after they were made. I told myself this was what families looked like now. Flexible. Busy. Modern. But hospitals have a way of stripping life down to what is essential. As the anesthesiologist asked me my name one last time and someone tucked the blanket closer around my shoulders, I thought of Harold's voice on that quiet Sunday afternoon. That girl does not ask questions unless she already wants the answers to belong to her. And for the first time, I stopped wondering whether Nicole had been cruel that morning because she was impatient. I began to wonder how long she had been planning for a future in which my needs, my choices, and even my place in the family could be managed like paperwork. When I opened my eyes in recovery, the first thing I noticed was the clock on the wall. 3:48. The second was the dry ache in my throat, the heavy cotton feeling in my head, and the third was the simple, unadorned fact that Daniel was still not there. A nurse in lavender scrubs adjusted the blanket over my legs and asked me how my pain level felt on a scale from 1 to 10. I told her it was manageable, which was true in the most technical sense. Physical discomfort has edges. You can locate it, measure it, wait for it to ease. What sat in my chest that afternoon was harder to classify. It was not panic. That had passed sometime between the pre-operative holding area and the moment the anesthesiologist told me to think of someplace peaceful. It was not even sadness exactly. Sadness is soft around the edges. This was sharper, cleaner. The nurse offered me ice chips, and I let them melt slowly on my tongue while I listened to the curtain tracks sliding now and then, the low beeping from nearby monitors, and the distant voice of someone laughing at the nurse's station. Ordinary hospital sounds. Life moving forward on schedule. My own life, however, no longer felt scheduled by accident. Felt arranged. About 20 minutes later, another nurse came by with a clipboard and discharge notes. She was middle-aged, brisk without being cold, the sort of woman who probably alphabetized her spices at home and had no patience for avoidable chaos. "Your contact person has not checked in yet," she said. "Would you like us to call June Donnelly when you are ready?" "Yes," I answered. Then before I could stop myself, I asked, "Has anyone else called?" She glanced at the chart. "There was a message left earlier asking whether you would need assistance at home for several days, and whether discharge instructions could be discussed with family in advance." She looked up. "I told them we only review that directly with the patient unless there is a signed authorization." My mouth went dry all over again. "Who called?" I asked, though I already knew. "Nicole Parker," she said. "She identified herself as your daughter." There it was again. Not daughter-in-law. Daughter. A revision so small on paper and so enormous in meaning that I felt it like a draft under a closed door. Nicole had not only abandoned me at the house. She had also tried to get ahead of what came after. She wanted access to the part of illness that creates leverage. Medications. Limitations. Recovery timelines. The practical details a controlling person can turn into a narrative. She is not safe alone. She needs more help than she admits. It would be better if we handled things. I had heard versions of those sentences before, though never directed quite so openly at me. My own mother had used them about an aunt after a hip replacement, back when family concern still meant casseroles and folded laundry instead of subtle takeovers dressed in efficient language. The nurse continued explaining my post-procedure instructions, but part of me had already stepped away from the room and into a colder place inside my own mind, one where memories were beginning to line up with frightening precision. Nicole asking 2 months. Earlier, whether I had ever considered one of those charming senior communities with the walking paths and clubhouses. Nicole standing in my kitchen the week before, looking at my pill organizer and saying, "It must be exhausting keeping track of all that by yourself." Nicole offering just last Friday to help me streamline paperwork, in case the surgery left me tired. At the time I had heard those remarks the way women of my generation are trained to hear many things, softened by habit, diluted by politeness, filed away under maybe she means well. But recovery has a way of stripping illusion down to the studs. Lying there in a narrow bed with a plastic bracelet around my wrist and hospital socks on my feet, I no longer heard concern in any of it. I heard reconnaissance. "Mrs. Parker?" the nurse said gently, and I realized she had asked whether I felt dizzy. "No," I said. "Just awake." It was the truest thing I had said all day. By the time June arrived, carrying my cardigan folded neatly over one arm and my overnight bag in the other, I had already made a quiet decision. I would not confront Daniel on the phone. I would not send Nicole some wounded message she could show him later as proof that I was emotional and confused. I would recover. I would watch. And I would begin paying attention with the same accuracy Harold once had. Because the woman who had tried to insert herself into my hospital records was not improvising. She was following a plan. And for the first time since Harold died, I had stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things and started asking the only question that mattered. How much had they already set in motion while assuming I would be too weak, too grateful, or too alone to notice? The ride home felt longer than the trip there, although June took the same roads, the same turns, the same careful pace over every patch of rough pavement. Recovery changes distance. A 10-minute traffic light feels personal. A speed bump feels like betrayal. I leaned back against the headrest with my cardigan folded between my shoulder, and the seatbelt because the pressure across my middle made me wince if I breathed too deeply. June kept the radio off. She did not fill the silence with cheerful nonsense, and for that alone I could have kissed her. Kindness from some people arrives dressed as chatter. Kindness from June came as restraint. About halfway home, while we were stopped behind a delivery truck on Maple Avenue, she said, "I did not want to bring this up before your procedure." I turned my head toward her slowly. "Bring what up?" Her fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "I saw Daniel and Nicole last week." There are sentences that make the body go cold faster than bad news itself, because they confirm a shape your mind has been circling without wanting to name. I looked at the passing storefronts, the laundromat, the insurance office, the little diner with the sun-faded sign out front and said, "Where?" "First near Briar Glen," she answered. "Then at the real estate office 2 doors down." Briar Glen was not a neighborhood. It was one of those polished senior living communities developers describe with words like lifestyle and independence, as if softened language can disguise the fact that most families only start researching such places when they are imagining how to rearrange an older relative's life without asking permission. I felt a tightness gather beneath my ribs that had nothing to do with stitches or medication. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I am old, not blind," June said. Nicole was carrying one of those glossy folders they hand out at the front desk. Daniel looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Then the two of them went into Harrison and Cole Realty and stayed there for about half an hour. Harrison and Cole had sold 3 homes on our street in the past year, including the little ranch across from the elementary school. I had baked a lemon loaf for the young couple who bought it. They had a baby with cheeks like dinner rolls and a golden retriever that tried to sit on everyone's feet. The ordinary sweetness of that memory almost offended me now. My own home, the red brick Colonial Herald, and I had spent 32 years paying off, painting, repairing, and filling with the layered evidence of a real life, had become part of some conversation I had not been invited into. "They could have been looking for an investment property," I said, though even to my own ears the sentence sounded tired. June did not embarrass me by pretending to believe it. "They might have been," she said carefully. But when Nicole came out, she was smiling the way people smile when they think something is about to go their way. We pulled into my driveway a few minutes later. The maple in the front yard still had not fully leafed out, and the porch rail Harold had repainted every other spring looked slightly weathered at the edges. Home should have felt like relief. Instead it felt newly vulnerable, as if I were seeing for the first time how desirable it might look to someone who had never loved it, only measured it. June parked and turned to me. "Do you want me to come inside?" she asked. I should have said no. I was raised to refuse help at least twice before accepting it once. But surgery strips away some of the sillier manners. "Yes," I said. "Please." Nicole's car was not in the driveway. Daniel's was not either. The house sat in a silence so complete it almost seemed staged. June helped me to the front door, then carried my bag in while I moved one careful step at a time across the entryway tile. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the hour with its gentle chime. Harold had wound that clock every Sunday afternoon without fail, and after he died I had learned to do it myself. Strange the skills widowhood forces into your hands. June guided me to the sofa and brought me a glass of water without asking where anything was, as if she understood that the dignity of being helped often depends on how little the helper makes you explain. I had just settled back against the cushions when my phone buzzed on the side table. "Daniel." His name lit up the screen with such perfect timing that I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the performance of concern had finally arrived, late enough to reveal itself as theater. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," he said, voice too bright, too casual. "I was just checking in. How did everything go?" I looked around my living room at the framed family photos, the lamp Harold picked out because he liked the brass base, the Afghan draped over the chair by the window, and I realized with startling calm that my son was no longer asking from inside the life we had shared. He was asking from somewhere just outside it, where reports mattered more than presence. "It went fine," I said. June took me. There was a pause. Tiny, but enough. Then he said, "Oh, good, good." In the background I thought I heard Nicole speaking, too far from the phone for words, close enough for influence. And in that small, careful silence between what my son said and what he did not say, the last of my doubt began to die. The next 2 days taught me something I should have learned years earlier. People reveal far more when they believe you are weak than when they believe you are watching. I moved carefully through the house, partly because the doctor had told me to, partly because slowness gave me cover. Pain, even mild pain, is a useful disguise. No one questions a woman who sits quietly, keeps a blanket over her knees, and says she is tired. They assume she is not paying attention. They assume medication has blurred the edges of her mind. They assume gratitude will soften her instincts. Nicole arrived the morning after my surgery carrying a paper bag from an expensive coffee place and wearing an expression she must have practiced in the mirror, something halfway between concern and efficiency. Daniel came in behind her with a grocery sack, and the guilty posture of a man who hopes errands can substitute for character. "How are you feeling?" Nicole asked, setting the coffee on the kitchen counter as if she belonged there more than I did. "Sore," I said. "But alive, which I suppose is still fashionable." She gave a polite little laugh that did not reach her eyes. Daniel stepped closer and kissed my cheek. "Sorry I could not make it yesterday, Mom. Things got complicated at work." I looked at him for a moment. At 41, he still had the same cowlick near his temple he had at 10, the same tendency to speak gently when he was avoiding the truth. Once that softness had made him kind. Now it mostly made him available to stronger people. "June got me there," I said. "And home." He nodded too quickly. "Right. Good. I am glad somebody could help." Somebody. Not I am sorry I was not there. Not I should have been the one. Just somebody. Nicole had already opened my refrigerator. She stood there scanning shelves with the brisk concentration of a person conducting an inspection rather than a visit. "You really need more prepared food in here," she said. "Recovery is going to be harder if you insist on doing everything yourself." I stayed quiet. She took my silence for permission and kept going. "Daniel and I were talking, and maybe it is time to consider a few temporary adjustments. Just until you are back on your feet." There it was. Not concern. Agenda. Wrapped in the clean paper of practical language. Daniel leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. He did not look at me. "Nicole found a couple of places that offer short-term stays for seniors after medical procedures," he said. "Places with transportation, meals, nurses on site. It could make things easier." Easier for whom, I wondered. But I only folded the throw blanket a little tighter over my lap and asked, "Did my doctor suggest that?" Nicole turned from the refrigerator and shut the door with one manicured hand. "Doctors do not always understand what day-to-day life really looks like," she said. "This house has stairs. Your bathroom is dated. And frankly, if something happened while you were here alone, it would become a much bigger issue." She said issue the way other women say weather. As if consequences simply drift in from outside, not from decisions made by the people in the room. "I managed last night," I said. "With help from a neighbor," Nicole replied. "Which proves the point." Then she softened her voice, and that was somehow worse. "Evelyn, nobody is saying you cannot stay independent. We are only talking about the smart choice while you recover." Smart choice. Practical. Temporary adjustments. Short-term stays. Families do not seize control all at once anymore. They circle it with cheerful synonyms until resistance sounds unreasonable. I let my gaze move from Nicole to Daniel. He was still not looking directly at me. Instead, he was studying the fruit bowl Harold bought in Vermont 20 years ago, the blue ceramic one with the tiny chip on the rim. "And where exactly did you find these places?" I asked. Nicole brightened almost imperceptibly, the way salespeople do when the conversation turns toward logistics. "One is Briar Glen," she said. "It is lovely, actually. Walking paths, physical therapy, private. Dining room. Daniel and I stopped by last week just to gather information." Just to gather information. June's words settled beside that sentence with the neat click of a lock turning. Then Nicole added, too quickly, "There was no reason to upset you before your procedure." I do not know what showed on my face in that moment. Whatever it was, Daniel finally looked up. For one brief second I saw him clearly, not as my little boy grown older, not as a husband caught between women, but as a man who had allowed planning to replace honesty because honesty would have required courage. "I see," I said. And I did. More than they realized. Because once a person speaks of your future as if they have already toured it without you, the truth becomes difficult to mistake. They thought I was recovering on that sofa. In a way I was. But I was also learning the exact shape of the room they had been trying to move me out of. The morning after their visit, I called my lawyer before I even made coffee. That alone told me how far things had shifted. For most of my life, legal help belonged to major events, buying a house, settling Harold's estate, signing papers that marked the beginning or ending of something large. It was not part of ordinary Tuesday mornings in a quiet kitchen with pale spring light on the counters and a half-full dish rack by the sink. But then, betrayal rarely arrives wearing a sign large enough for everyone to read. More often it slips into ordinary life and waits for one practical woman to call it by its proper name. My attorney, Robert Klein, had handled Harold's will and the transfer of the house after his death. He was in his late 50s, careful with words, and blessed with the kind of face people trust because it never looks entertained by other people's pain. When his receptionist put me through, he listened without interrupting while I explained only the facts. My daughter-in-law changed her relationship in the hospital system. She requested discharge information without authorization. She and my son visited a senior community without telling me. They also met with a real estate office. There was a short silence on the line, not confused, not doubtful, simply attentive. "Evelyn," he said at last, "I think it would be wise for you to come in and review every document connected to your home, your medical directives, and your estate plan. Wise. Not dramatic. Not premature. Wise." I wrote down the appointment time in my neatest handwriting and felt something settle inside me. Not fear. Structure. That afternoon, June drove me downtown again, this time to Robert's office on the third floor of a brick building with brass directory signs and a waiting room that still smelled faintly of copier toner and lemon polish. I wore my navy coat and a scarf Harold bought me in Vermont years ago, and I sat very straight in the conference room while Robert laid folders across the table one by one. Deed. Medical power of attorney. Living will. Beneficiary designations. Emergency contacts. He walked me through each page slowly, never once assuming age had made me fragile or confused. I cannot explain how much dignity there is in being addressed plainly when others have already started speaking around you. "As things stand," he said, tapping one section with his pen, "Daniel would have significant authority if you were ever deemed temporarily unable to manage decisions for yourself. If that concerns you, it can be changed." Concern. Another clean word. I looked at the paper, then at my own hands resting on the table. The skin was thinner than it once had been. The veins stood out more. But they were still my hands. The same hands that buttoned Daniel's winter coat, balanced budgets, planted marigolds by the front walk, held Harold's hand through chemotherapy, signed checks, kneaded bread, polished silver, and turned a house into a life. Weakness had not entered the room. Only clarity had. "Yes," I said. "It concerns me. We changed everything that needed changing. Medical authority. Emergency instructions. Access permissions. Review requirements for any future property matter." Robert also recommended placing additional protections around the house so that no sale, transfer, or refinancing could happen without direct verified action from me. I signed each page slowly, carefully, and without trembling. By the time we finished, the stack of papers at my elbow looked almost ceremonial, as if I were not merely updating records but reclaiming authorship over my own life. On the ride home, June glanced over at me at a stoplight and said, "You look better." I knew what she meant, though the stitches still pulled when I moved the wrong way, and I was still tired by late afternoon. "I am better," I said, and I was not healed, but steadier. That evening, Daniel called and asked whether I needed anything from the store. His voice had that softened edge people use when they want access to information without appearing to ask for it directly. "No," I said. "I had an appointment today." He paused. "Everything all right?" I looked around my living room at the lamplight falling over Harold's chair, the family photos on the mantel, the quiet order of the house they had already begun discussing as if it were a pending opportunity. "Yes," I said. "Everything is being updated." I heard the smallest shift in his breathing, barely there, but enough. He knew the word. He had heard it from Nicole often enough. And now, at last, it belonged to me. 3 days later, I invited Daniel and Nicole over for Sunday supper. I kept the menu simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with butter, and the peach cobbler Harold loved, because there is a particular kind of power in setting a beautiful table when you already know the truth about the people coming to sit at it. I used the good plates, lit the small candles, folded the linen napkins into neat rectangles. By then I was moving better, though not quickly, and the soreness still reminded me to be careful when I reached for something on a high shelf. But pain had stopped being the center of the story. Clarity had taken its place. Nicole arrived first, carrying a bakery box she placed on the counter without asking whether I needed anything. Daniel followed with a bottle of sparkling water and that same careful expression he had worn all week, as though he hoped good manners might blur the outline of bad choices. "You should not have gone to all this trouble," Nicole said, looking around the dining room in the approving way strangers admire a venue. "Recovery is supposed to be restful." "This is restful," I said. "For me." We sat down a few minutes later, and for the first 10 minutes I let them talk. Nicole mentioned a friend who had just renovated a kitchen in Naperville. Daniel talked about a client presentation and the traffic near the loop. I passed the potatoes, poured iced tea, asked whether the weather forecast still promised rain by Tuesday. It was almost easy, which is one of the saddest things about family disappointment. People who have failed you will often accept normalcy as a gift without ever noticing it is one. Halfway through dinner, Nicole set down her fork and gave me the same composed smile she used when she wanted something to sound reasonable before it sounded final. "I actually brought a brochure," she said, "just so you could look at it when you feel up to it. No pressure." She reached into her bag and placed a glossy folder beside my water glass. Briar Glen. Sunlit walking paths on the front. A silver-haired woman in white slacks smiling beside a flower bed she almost certainly did not choose herself. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Mom, we just thought it might help to have options." I looked at the brochure for a moment, then folded my napkin and set it on my plate. "How thoughtful," I said. "You mean like the options you explored last week before my surgery?" The room changed then. Not loudly. The candles still burned. The clock in the hallway still ticked. But all the air shifted direction. Daniel's hand stopped halfway to his glass. Nicole's face remained composed for one admirable second before the surprise showed through. "I am not sure what you mean," she said. "I think you are," I answered. "You visited Briar Glen. Then you stopped at Harrison and Cole Realty. June Donnelly saw you." Daniel looked at Nicole first. That told me everything. Not whether he knew I had found out, but where his instincts still went when he felt cornered. Nicole recovered quickly. Women like her usually do. "Evelyn, this is exactly why we wanted to approach the subject gently," she said. "You are taking bits of information and turning them into something upsetting when we were only trying to help." "Help?" I repeated. "Is that what you call refusing to take me to the hospital, listing yourself as my daughter in the hospital system, and asking about discharge plans before I was even out of surgery?" Daniel went pale at that. "Nicole," he said quietly. She turned toward him with practiced indignation. "I was trying to make sure she had support." "No," I said, and my voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You were trying to position yourself." Silence followed. The kind that reveals rather than conceals. I reached to the sideboard and picked up the envelope I had placed there before they arrived. Crisp cream paper. Robert Klein's letterhead visible through the flap. I laid it on the table between the salt cellar and the butter dish. "Since we are discussing support," I said, "I should let you both know that all of my documents have been updated." Nicole's eyes dropped to the envelope. Daniel did not touch his food again. "My medical directives have changed. My emergency contacts have changed. Access permissions have changed. And the house is fully protected from any transfer, refinancing, or sale without my direct verified authorization." I let that settle before adding the part that mattered most. "No one is making decisions for me behind my back ever again." Daniel finally looked at me, then really looked, and I saw shame arrive too late to be noble. "Mom," he began, but I raised one hand. "The morning I stood on my porch with my hospital bag while your wife told me she was not a taxi service for old women, something became very clear. I was not dealing with misunderstanding. I was dealing with people who had started planning my life as if I were already diminished." Nicole's mouth tightened. "That is unfair." "No," I said. "It is accurate." Accuracy had belonged to Harold once. Now it belonged to me. I stood slowly, one careful movement at a time, and though my body was still healing, I had not felt taller in years. "Finish your dinner if you like," I said. "Or do not. But hear me clearly. The day I needed care was the day you showed me exactly who you were. And from now on, this house, this life, and every decision connected to it remain in my hands." No one answered. Daniel stared at the table. Nicole stared at the envelope. And for the first time since Harold died, I no longer felt like the woman being managed in my own home. I felt like its rightful keeper. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.